Ladies and gentlemen, this is David Mirikitani with another episode of Matt Chat brought to you by USA Wrestling, the national governing body for wrestling in the United States, and by Nike Wrestling. Go to athleteps.com for all of your Nike and USA Wrestling branded gear. It is a rarity for me to get to talk to someone on air that I've never actually talked to in my life, but I'm super excited about it today, folks. Two-time national collegiate champion, two-time U.S. Open champion, and a champion of the Oregon, one of the most prestigious tournaments in the entire world, Emma Bruntil. Emma, I'm super excited. Thanks for coming on with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, so I reached out to you. You put a post out, and you helped me pull it up here so we can talk about it back in September. And you titled it "My Farewell to College Wrestling: Why it was decided it was time to say goodbye." And I think if you're like any of us in wrestling, you look at other people's social media, and a lot of it's the same stuff. Like, we won, here's who we think. We didn't win, but we learned. And I don't mean that in a good or bad way, but it's typical, right? There's not a lot of new ground, right? And your post was so, I just want to say it was powerful. So I'm going to start with that and just kind of see where it leads us, because I think you have some really interesting, provocative thoughts, and especially for somebody that's, I think you have a lot of wisdom for your age. So I'm really interested in kind of picking your brain about it. So you titled this "My Farewell to College Wrestling: Why I Decided It Was Time to Say Goodbye." I'm going to sort of paraphrase this. A lot of people were shocked when I left. On paper, everything looked great. Talked about a herniated disc, a C6 nerve root, just the pain with MRIs. I had a meeting with our coaching staff. Things seemed to be okay. I needed to get ready for U23s. I was going to be on a pitch count for the college season. I very quickly found out it wasn't going to be the case. My neck was so painful I could hardly even stay in my stance. It was hard to sleep at night. Hands would go numb. I kept breaking glasses and dishes in my house because I could no longer grip objects in my right hand. I'm going to stop here for a second. A lot of us that wrestled are pretty beat up from over the years, and I'm sure you're headed for a life of that, of arthritis and things like that. And I mean, when you're literally dropping things, when you're used to putting your hands on the toughest women in the world and hand fighting and winning a lot of those hand fights, like, just emotionally, what was that like for you?
Yeah, so for me, it all kind of started back in 2020 because I have a fake disc in my neck. I had a disc arthroplasty, and luckily that one was successful and it totally fixed my problems for a while. The problem was at Olympic team camp. I actually herniated the level above that. So my health just pretty quickly deteriorated, especially after the 2021 World Team Trials when I was in the finals with Forrest. Kind of right after that is when it really sharply went downhill. So yeah, like you said, it's not a huge confidence boost to like want to have U23 Worlds coming up and, like trying to be like, okay, I'm going to be on the world stage in like 6 weeks. And meanwhile, like I couldn't even like get into a stance. Yeah, I'd have tons of nerve pain. In class, like I would have to hold my head up like this because I couldn't like sit in a lecture for like and be able to hold my own head up. So it was just kind of like not a great confidence booster. And I was also just in a lot of pain. I actually had to get a spine injection just so I could go to U23 Worlds. So being in the hospital, like getting this injection and stuff hooked up to an IV, like, 15 days out from competition, it's not, I didn't have a great Worlds that year. I lost in the quarters. Like, it just wasn't, the best way to prepare for competition. And then, like I said in the article, there was just a lot of conflict. And I think there is in college wrestling in general with how injuries are handled, with just like what said, like what the treatment plan, like what it was going to be, and then what it actually was just two completely different things.
Yeah. I think, first of all, I know you're not trying to be tough, and I think 99% of the people that watch my podcast or these podcasts are wrestling people. But if a 1%er watched it and you said you were dropping dishes and you couldn't sleep, and you're like, so it wasn't the ideal training camp. Like, most, like just the level of how you're framing that. And, USA Wrestling teaches a lot about reframing things in a positive way. Just like, yeah, it wasn't great. I only made the quarters. Most people would be like, I'm done. I quit. I'm in the hospital. So, yeah, I would imagine, and the other thing is, mindset is so important on these things, right? Like, if you feel like you can do it, if you have confidence, you generally will wrestle to the best of your ability and sometimes beat somebody on paper you're not supposed to. So I would imagine that was just unbelievable. So you mentioned that while this was going on, your dad had a herniated L5. He could hardly walk or even move. He was one of your biggest training partners. It was immensely difficult for me to see him going through so much pain. Unfortunately, I was fighting a whole nother battle on a different front. The things I had to do to accommodate my injury were met with constant pushback, and my actions were perceived as just faking it. I wasn't allowed to modify my training, despite MRIs, epidurals, neurologist letters. There's nothing I could do to convince people that what I was dealing with was real. I knew that if I couldn't finish a practice, that if I couldn't do what the rest of the team was able to, I would pay a price for it. That price would often end up being comments intended to diminish my reputation that were made in front of the entire team. I was told if I couldn't do everything during training or that I couldn't compete, I would no longer be coached anymore. So, first of all, it's sad to hear that. Any of us that have ever coached would hope we would never treat anybody that way, good, bad, or otherwise. And it reminds me of something like, for example, Spencer Lee didn't wrestle the last couple duels. And on social media, people are like, they're not trying to grow wrestling. And I was a college coach for about 20 years and I recruited, and you've certainly been on the recruiting side of it and certainly smart enough to know what a good recruiter says and promises. And I think if you're a person of your word, the most important thing is, like, if I sat with your mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or older brother or sister, whoever's part of your decision-making process, and I say, I'm going to treat Emma like family. I'm going to treat Emma as if she were my own. And sometimes that means I'm going to have to yell at her if she's not doing what she's supposed to do, but it's always going to be with her best interest in mind, keeping in mind that I'm being paid to win matches. And there's this conflict. And like, I have a father who always erred on the side of, we're not going to wrestle you, and I'll be honest, there was times I'm like, man, we got to wrestle that guy. He's not that hurt. So as somebody that was genuinely hurt, maybe let's start with, how could the communication have been fair and more positive?
Yeah, so I think to preface all of this, like I think it was really hurtful to me, just the situation at the time, because like you said, like I had never been someone, like, I've competed, I've had 7 surgeries, I've had a lot of major injuries, ones that like are never actually going to get better, that I just have had to learn how to manage. Like I don't have cartilage in my left knee anymore, and that's something like I had to learn how to manage. So for me to compete through so many injuries and like know how to do that pretty well, I was in a situation that I'd kind of never been in before, where the level of pain I was in and just how much it was affecting my training. Because on bad days, like I couldn't do normal things. Like I couldn't drive my car because I couldn't look a certain way, let alone like wrestle. So it was hard. I was in a new kind of situation. But in general, I've wrestled through a lot of major stuff. So it was a little hurtful to be told, I was kind of just being a wimp, and have that be kind of put out there to other people, when like I'm like, dude, I have done so much, especially when I came into the program. We won 2 team titles, right? Both years, my freshman, sophomore year, I was there. And then I won 2 individual titles my freshman, sophomore year. So I felt like I was, I had really played my part, the last couple years. It's not like I hadn't contributed to the team or to my own individual aspirations. And then to be framed as like someone who was faking it, when, I feel like I'd really been trying my best, the whole time I was there, that was definitely hurtful. I think when it comes to injuries, like I had a meeting as soon as I got my MRI results back, saying like, herniated disc, foraminal stenosis, which means like your nerves are being impinged on. I went to my coaching staff right away and I said, hey, like, this is the diagnosis. Like I haven't met with my surgeons yet to really talk about what this is going to mean for me, but I wanted to get it in the air and like out there. And pretty much the message I received right away was like, if you can't compete at everything, and I'm sure they wouldn't have minded me not wrestling at some random open, but basically like, if you can't compete, we can't continue putting time into you, because that's time that we're not putting into the next girl. And so like, basically, if you can't compete, we're not going to waste our time on you. Which, like you said, it's like, I understand there is an aspect of college wrestling that is about winning. But I can say I've never felt that from the coaches that I've had that are really like when you say, oh, like coaches, we're going to treat you like family. The coaches that have treated me like family have never, made it like that situation. They've never been like, hey, at the first, sign of trouble, we're just going to drop you. They're like, okay, we'll make a plan. We'll figure it out, help you how I can. And like, let's make this work. And that's all I wanted, right? Was like a way to figure out, let's make this work. But it was extremely inflexible and very, like you said, winning was at the forefront. And we were trying to win our third national title that year. So it was pretty much like either win or get out of the way is what it felt like at the time.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think, I think like a lot of times the golden rule is a pretty good way to help you make good decisions, right? Like if you don't know what to do, like do unto others. And I would imagine that if a coach had a daughter, they have a good idea how they want that daughter to be treated. I feel like, I don't know this, it just feels like, so I'm not saying this is a fact because it's not, it feels like there's some sexism there. And what I mean by that is, I don't think anybody's going, Spencer Lee's a wimp and doesn't want to wrestle, right? Like that's the craziest thing in the world. He's doing pull-ups with 150 pounds wrapped around his body and he's a killer, but you're a killer too. And I mean, that word is a compliment to both of you guys. I also think it is sort of a gross overestimation that during your first 2 years there, you were somehow never hurt or injured, right? Like, that's implying that you had perfect health for 24 months. And then like the first time you had a hangnail, like now all of a sudden you're in the training room 6 hours a day. Like I'm sure like anybody that wrestles that much, you battled injuries and were successful, right?
Yeah, so when I had my first neck surgery, that was actually after my freshman season. So I did my rehab all of that summer and then came back after my freshman season and won my second national title that following year. And that was like the year of Olympic trials and stuff. And then, like I said, I don't have cartilage in my left knee. So it really doesn't interfere with my wrestling that much. I just can't run long distances or do like a lot of jumping because of the impact. But my wrestling is fairly unchanged. But those are like some of the long-term injuries I managed, throughout my entire time at college, before even any of the, the herniation, all of that stuff came about my junior year.
Yeah, I think the other thing is this, like I always call this like a funnel, like when, and this probably isn't as fair for women, although it's getting better. So I'll use boys as an example. Like when you're like one of the Tulsa kickoff, we're recording this on the Monday before Thanksgiving, November 21st. And the Tulsa kickoff just happened and there's people posting their pictures with Eagles. Like when you're a little kid, if you want, you can get in 100 matches a year. I
Yeah.
mean, there tournaments all over the place. And then you get to high school and maybe it's 80 with the off season, maybe more, but and then when you get to college, like a lot of these colleges now are barely scheduling 16, 17 matches. And then unless you're really good, they don't wrestle you in the summertime. It's all training and improving. And then when you get to the international level, like where you are, maybe you wrestle in 5 tournaments a year, depending on the year and how your body's feeling. It's the less is more philosophy. I guess like the other thing I think that really pops out to me is this, like you build trust in a relationship. Okay. So I'll use me as your coach because I'm older than you. If every day we start practice at 3 and every day you're there with your shoes tied at 2:55, if there's one day you're late and you don't call or text and you've been on time for 4 months, I'm actually probably more worried about if you're okay than angry if you're late. Now, if every other day, like you walk in like at 2:59 and you still have your backpack on your back and you haven't kind of changed clothes but you're in the ballpark of 3:00 when it happens and you're not there till 3:05, I'm going to be annoyed because this is your pattern. Like you establish a pattern, you establish trust or distrust, you establish accountability, responsibility, or lack thereof. And if you're a kid, at the time you're a 19-year-old kid winning nationals, you're either amazingly talented or else you're doing things the right way. Like, or it could be both, but I mean, like you're doing things the right way. You're on time. You're not a problem. You're not a behavioral. You're a good example. You're probably a leader, even as a freshman, certainly as a sophomore. It's super disappointing that you weren't given, I guess, more leeway.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, I think there's some factors as far as, and you can even see it in research, like medically, like women's pain is definitely treated differently. Like when a woman is in pain, most people will go like, oh, she's just being emotional or over dramatizing things, right? Or if a guy comes to them, and I've seen this a lot, like when a guy goes to an athletic trainer versus a girl, and I'm not saying this to be provocative, I'm just saying based off the experiences I've had, is when a guy goes to a trainer, it tends to be taken a little more seriously because they're like, oh man, if he's saying this, he must be really hurt. But then if a girl goes to the trainer with even the same problem, sometimes it's not taken with the same level of like severity. So that's definitely something I've noticed. And I think too, there was some patterns as far as like uh, the coaching and all that, trying to control factors outside of like my wrestling in the room, like just being overall pretty controlling. And then also factors of like, especially my junior year, like they, I don't know if they recognize that I had a certain level of influence, or but when you have someone on your team, and we had a couple girls who were winning national titles, right, and doing well on the senior level, it just kind of happens that way no matter how old you are. There was definitely like they didn't really want me, I think, to have a leadership role, which I just always tried to lead by example, and I was totally fine with that. But I think that even like unofficial leadership roles would have been something that was maybe perceived as threatening. So I think there was that going on. And then I think, yeah, like you're totally right with just how women are perceived with injuries compared to men.
I feel like that's institutional. I feel like there's probably been a time or two where I'm guilty of that, and I don't think it's intentional, right? Like it's not like being a racist and saying a bad word, like that's intentional, right? Like it's almost like you said, like, oh, if Billy says he's hurt, he's probably really hurt. And if Emma says, sure, well, maybe she had a fight with her boyfriend or something, like, and it's terrible that it's not, it should be Billy's on time all the time and Susie isn't on time. So, or Susie's out of shape. So she's just saying she's hurt because she doesn't want to go live. Like if that's the case, it should be based on their performance, not based on their gender. Now, if the genders happen to align that way, that's different. But yeah, it's not good.
I think overall too, the kind of approach that I kind of ran into, and I think is common above college teams, is like the team is always put first, which I agree with to a point, as far as like the team is put first, but you have to make sure all the individuals are getting what they need as well, right? Because if you have someone, that has a herniated disc in their neck, they're probably going to need different things than someone who has a completely healthy neck. And I think that this like live or die by like team only and team first, it kind of negates kind of individualities that, like you said, if you have a relationship established where this person is truthful and that they're being honest about their injuries. And I also had neurologists, MRIs, like things on paper to prove what I was.
Documented. Yeah, I'm laughing because it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, you didn't get a note from your mom. Like it's real
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting because I had this thing that would happen because my nerves were so damaged on the right side, is my whole arm would go numb, and it kind of started like just in my hands, and then it got really bad a couple times where like it felt like I couldn't feel my arm at all, which is like pretty alarming. And like I couldn't feel my arm anymore. And so I was talking to my neurologist, and he was like, hey, when that happens, you need to stop wrestling, because if you continue to do that when you are getting, numbness in your entire arm, you're just going to continue doing nerve damage, because that to a neurologist constitutes a damaged nerve when you can't feel your arm.
I think to a human being that would constitute a damage.
So
Yeah.
I was like, hey, can you please put that in writing? Because I'm not gonna be able to do that unless it's like in writing. So can you please write me a note? And I actually gave that note to the athletic trainer at the time, and I was like, hey, can you please explain this in a way that coaches can understand? I feel like it always, goes better from athletic trainers to coaches, because they're medical professionals, than me as an athlete just being like, hey, here's like what I think, right? Because I'm not a medical professional. And it was never explained. Like, so I think stuff like
the
that.
trainer refused to explain it?
Yeah, well, she said she would try, and then it just never happened. So
She did. Yeah.
So I think stuff like that happens all the time. And like you said, I don't think it's this inadvertent thing. I think there's a lot of societal norms that were ingrained for so long that we're just working to overcome, right? Like for a long time, it was a societal norm that women couldn't have, a job, let alone like wrestle other human beings. So I think with time, it'll continue getting better. And I think just bringing more awareness to the issue. And like you said, maybe focusing on, hey, like patterns of trust, regardless of gender, rather than like, women tend to do this and men tend to do this. Like, let's look at the individual relationship and see what the patterns are. And if it's a pattern of like, hey, this person has been, working really hard, doing these things for months or years, and then they have something come up, they're probably like going through something really serious,
They deserve the benefit of the doubt. I mean, if you take sports out of it, like if you have 10 friends you hang out with, there's probably 3 or 4 of them that are super reliable and 2 or 3 of them that are super flaky. And like you never make plans with just one of the 2 or 3 flaky ones, because there's a 50% chance you're going to get stood up. They're like the group friends. You bring them along when you already know you got 3 or 4 people going. And
Exactly.
again, that's based on the trust that they've built or not built. Okay, so to go back to this, by the time U23s rolled around, I've been effectively coaching myself for 6 weeks. My neck was worse than ever. Spirit was broken, severe anxiety, paranoia, isolation. 2 options: I could continue training the way I was, lose 75% of the strength in the arm for the rest of my life, and have irreversible nerve damage, undergo another neck surgery. As much as I didn't want to uproot the entire life I'd built, I knew I didn't want either of those choices. So after choosing to leave the team, I didn't train anywhere for 6 weeks. I had talked about this time in my life in another article I wrote shortly after the Euregan. What I didn't discuss, however, was how the fallout of my injury and the circumstances around affected me mentally. Even after winning the Euregan, and it's pronounced the Don Kolov, right?
Yeah, that's the one in Bulgaria.
Right. I didn't trust anyone. I had no concept of this is really powerful. I had no concept of what a coach-athlete relationship should be like. So I just tried to avoid it altogether. This slowly bled into other relationships in my life, to the point where I only really trusted my parents and my brother. I was having panic attacks, couldn't finish practice, hyperventilating. I learned that panic attacks are something you can't control. They're a physiological and psychological response to trauma. As a result of all this, I spent a lot of time just trying to feel okay again. And if it weren't for my coaches now, I really don't know where I would be. They took me in when I was mentally broken, and they showed me that it was okay to be injured, to be anxious, and most of all, to be human. I can only thank them enough for helping me get through. I can never thank them enough, for helping me get through these first few months. I feel like because of my success in those first tournaments, people probably thought leaving McKendree didn't affect me. That couldn't be farther from reality. Now, I understand at this point, you're probably wondering where my college decision plays in all of this. Well, when I first announced I was leaving, my phone was flooded with messages almost instantaneously. I told everyone I was figuring things out. I would get back to them in due time. At that point, I 100% believed the OTC, the Olympic Training Center, was just a temporary stop. After a few visits, and truthfully, I had a great time on the ones I took. I also began to develop a great relationship with my coach, Izzy, who I want to talk about because I hear wonderful things about him and never had the pleasure of meeting him. And after competing so much in the senior level and getting many injuries in college, I only had 5 matches that went the distance. Now suddenly I was getting pushed every single match. I loved it. I wanted to continue to make strides overseas. A huge factor in my decision, this is so on point, Emma, was the fact that as of now, the women don't really get much by winning college nationals. I won twice, and the most it got me was a sweatshirt. I know some universities give out rings or banners. That's something we never received. We couldn't accept any money from winning tournaments. Had I been in school this year, I would have had to turn down a large sum of money to compete in a singular notable tournament with almost no benefits. And you talk about NIL and female male. And you and I were talking off air about female male, and I will want to get into that too if we have time. As a result, I've ultimately decided to stay at the OTC and forfeit my college eligibility. My little sad I'll never be a 4 or 5 timer, of course. I also feel immensely confident in my decision. If there's anything I can impart on any coaches that might be reading this today, it would be that your actions truly do matter. When you coach an athlete, you assume an immense amount of authority over them. You're their guide, you're their teacher. You should be one of their biggest supporters as well. You have the power to truly make or break someone, and to have athletes' life hell to make an athlete's life hell if you really wanted to. It took me a long time to feel like I could trust any coaches again after that experience. It's something I still struggle with. I actually went and got treatment for PTSD. This was mind blowing. I actually run charity events for veterans with PTSD and amputation. So I can't relate, but it's at least a subject I'm familiar with. I also felt a huge obligation to come clean to what I was actually going on when I left school. I didn't want to put a fabricated message out inside image of my success on the outside. And you just sum it up. I hope everyone, I always treasure and I hope to have the same experiences with these folks on the world stage. So I'll just be honest with you, I'm not moved very often by stuff like that. You sort of get jaded. This is a blessed job for me where I get to talk to the best of the best. And because it's USA Wrestling, almost no one says no. But there's so many things to sort of unpack on that last piece of it. Let's start with the good news. You're happy where you are now, correct?
Yeah, I have like I said, Coach Izzy he's really amazing. I've been working with him since the Regan last year, and he definitely helped me kind of overcome that barrier of like I just thought I wouldn't be able to have relationships with coaches just because of my like negative experience. It just was really difficult for me to trust someone, especially when it came to my neck, and that's actually like where the source of panic attacks, like why they were happening. But he really helped me through that, and then having a lot more autonomy here over my career and like the decisions around medical decisions. Overall, I feel really great to be where I'm at. So.
Tell me a little bit about Coach Izzy. Like a couple years ago, I had the privilege of doing the play-by-play for the World Championships all 9 days. And obviously the women are a third of that. And he's in a lot of corners. You generally can't tell who somebody is from the outside, but seems like just a genuinely good human being. Seems like he really, truly cares about his athletes and also seems like a super smart human being.
Yeah, I mean, his wrestling is absolutely incredible. I mean, it's, proofs in the pudding. He's coached, Jakara, helped coach her to a world title, Mensa, all her titles. Like, he's played a really big role in, like, a lot of the Titan Mercury girls that are here in their careers. But I would say the thing that really stood out to me about him was just that, like, even though he coaches, and I think this was the difference between the only for the team mentality and, like, taking care of individual people is here, obviously, it's different because it's not a college team and we're not relying on each other in dual meets and stuff, but we still are a team as like, we see each other every day. Kind of when someone's down, people are trying to pick them up, right? Like we're a team in that sense of the word. And even though Izzy could easily be like, oh, I coach a lot of girls, so I don't have time to help this person when they're struggling, or I have, a world champion over here who's doing fine, so why would I need to help this person? He always like meets people where they're at the time, no matter really the result. I think he's very neutral, like good or bad. It's all about the progress and kind of keeping things moving forward. And like after Regan, it was funny because the Regan was in January and I had left school in November, so I was still very much like struggling as far as just kind of the PTSD stuff and the panic attacks, and then with coaches especially. I had actually tweaked my knee. I was wrestling Forrest in the finals and we got into this low single position and my knee like popped out. I could hear it like just pop. And I've had that happen a lot of times before, and it normally just takes like 6 weeks to feel kind of normal again. But the day after, I was like kind of limping around and stuff. And my face was pretty split open. And there was a Russian girl that had asked to like drill with me and, just like get on the mat. And I had told her yes. And then Izzy, like I kind of told him after the final, I was like, oh yeah, I heard my knee pop. And immediately he was like, you're not wrestling with the Russian girl tomorrow. He's like, that's not a good idea. Like you need to take care of yourself. And, after months of like having people tell me I was a faker for a herniated neck, I was like, what do you mean? Like my knees, it only just popped. Like it's okay. And then he was like, no, like just take tomorrow. And so I was like, just, he was still at the tournament coaching the day 2 girls, I believe. And I was already done. So I was just kind of on my own. And he called me to like, he just called me and it was like, hey, how's it going? And I didn't really understand why he was calling me. I was like, am I like in trouble or like, what did I do kind of deal? I was like, I don't understand. And I told him, I was like, I don't understand why you're calling me. And he was like, just to like make sure you're okay and like check up on you.
Care about you as a human being. Yeah.
And I had to like tell him later, like, oh, I just was like really struggling at the time. It's not, I didn't mean that in like a bad way. I just genuinely didn't understand. So I would say that's the time that really stuck out to me as far as like, oh, coaches, like I could still have a good coach athlete relationship with someone was kind of through that.
it's sad that someone who is just being genuinely nice to you, that it's gone, that you were treated in such a way that that was not a normal thing to process. That it wasn't just, oh, coach cares. Coach cares more about me walking for the rest of my life than about this practice tomorrow. Coach cares more about me as a person than if I win a tournament next month or even 6 months from now. And you summed it up very eloquently in the WordPress or the article, whatever the right terminology is for that, or your post, that coaches have a humongous impact on kids or young adults or adults, whatever the case may be, all the way up from like 5 to 50, I guess. And how seriously a person takes that really matters, and how much empathy they have. Like, I'm always amazed at coaches that, and I don't think you have to have been a great athlete to be a great coach, but I'm always amazed at coaches that were super mediocre as athletes, but they got all the answers now. And they can tell you when somebody else isn't being tough. And I'm like, I'm pretty old. I'm like, I watched you wrestle. Like, you quit a lot too, like, well, I learned from that. I'm like, well, there's one of the lessons you learn is to talk to somebody about it instead of talking at somebody and trying to embarrass them in front of everybody, because I'm pretty sure that wouldn't have worked on you. Nobody likes being ripped up, right?
Yeah, and I think that was the difference is like, it always came from a place of negativity in the previous environment I was in. Like everything was always based off of shame and like um yeah, there was never really any sort of positive feedback. It was like either you did your job or it was like something is wrong. And it was pretty satisfying after the Regan, I'm not gonna lie, because after I wrestled Forrest and lost to her, I was like pulled into a meeting when I got back, and it was kind of like going over everything like that I did wrong, which is like fine. I can take constructive feedback, but at the time, like I was told just up front, like you don't know how to fight, and that's why you lost. Is like you're just not a fighter. And I thought a couple things about that because I was like, okay, if that's really true, I was like, and you think I don't know how to fight, how is telling me that going to empower me to like be better? Like how is
No,
telling
it's, yeah.
like suck like basically gonna make them like improve? It's not. So I was like, even if that is true, then that's not really the way to go about it. And then also I was like, I don't think that's true because I've fought through like, I mean, I think most people that have had 7 surgeries before they're 22 probably would have retired, to be completely honest. So I feel
Most
like,
people probably would have retired after the second one. Yeah.
yeah, like I fought through some not great circumstances. And so coming back and actually beating Forrest in the Euregan finals, like it was just kind of validation for me that like it's not that I didn't know how to fight. It's just like I wasn't in the right environment to really foster that growth and that I needed. And I just think you can't do that much fueled by negativity, right? Like negativity and like feeding off doubt and all this stuff, like it can get you places, but I think really like wanting to go places out of passion rather than like scared of the consequences if you don't make it to the top, it's not really going to get you the same results, and it's not even gonna feel great. Like I remember after winning nationals my sophomore year, it's just like I honestly like didn't, and like there was Olympic trials coming up and stuff, but honestly just didn't care. Like, I still, even after the tournament, I was still just as anxious and just as like, it wasn't like winning all of a sudden made everything go away like people think it does. You still have those same emotions, right after you get off the podium.
Well, the thing you mentioned about the fight part, like, I don't want to speak for you, but I know there's been times in my life, like, even if it's in practice, like you're just beating the hell out of me. And I'm like, I don't keep fighting. I'm just like, I just take it. I just want it to be over with. And if the coach pulls you aside after practice and says, David, you're not a fighter, you're a quitter, or you go, David, I don't think you gave it everything you had today. I think that you kind of shut it down. And I know you have the fight in you. I've seen you when you fought. And what do we need to do to get that fight to come out of you? Like, you're making the same point. Look, you stopped wrestling. You gave up. You let Emma seize the day. You let her do whatever she wanted. That doesn't help either one of you. Emma doesn't get better just turning you at will. And you certainly don't get better getting turned at will.
Yeah.
But let's talk about, let's identify it. it's like if somebody tells a lie, that doesn't make them a liar for the rest of their life. It means they told a lie, you
Yeah.
know, and to just call somebody a liar or call somebody a quitter and identify them with that, the worst action, and say that's who you are as a human being is super, it's super counterproductive. And it's usually coming from somebody that by definition is probably in a glass house. I think they have flaws too. And so it's, I mean, I coached and I recruited, and at some point you put the phone down and you go, I can't make any more calls tonight. Well, you quit. I mean, there's somebody up on the West Coast you could have called, like, so everybody has a quit in them at some point. So, you and me had an interesting conversation off air before we talked about sort of the growth of women's wrestling, and really in the context of women's versus men's sports. And, I'm blessed. Like, again, USA Wrestling, I think, is extremely positive about women's sports. And, I just interviewed Josh Schomburger from the Women's World Cup, or from the World Cup committee, and the women and men are going to be on the same platform, one man, just at the same time, treated, it seems like, from what he's described, as equally as possible, which is deserving and fantastic. But I want to make sure I say this right. I think in general, more men are sports fans than women's fans. And you brought up something I want to get to, which was fascinating. I never thought of it. And so if more men are sports fans, it makes sense that they probably want to watch men in their
Yeah,
sport.
I think it can be different, but like you said, I think that's totally the case.
So you talked about the equivalent of what a female or a woman or girl, depending on the age, might be a fan of instead, and drew a parallel to what men might be critical about that, and then drew a parallel back to them. And so I thought it was really insightful. I'd ask that you say that on the air.
Yeah, so I think that women, and whether or not it's like, I think the narrative is changing now, but I think from a young age, previously women weren't really instilled with the, like, you can go out and be, the best in the world at whatever sport you want to do. It was just not something that was preached to young girls, maybe like 20, 30 years ago. That's being changed now. But so a lot of, men, they grow up playing sports, and then after, they stop playing sports, they become sports fans because it's a way to still feel included in whatever sport they like to watch, or they like are fans of certain players that they like. So that's how they stay connected with something that they grew up doing. And women, a lot of times, if they didn't grow up playing sports, they weren't encouraged to go play sports, or they just didn't have as deep of a connection with what they did. A lot of them turn to like more of the entertainment industry. Like, people are really into like The Bachelor, or Keeping Up with the Kardashians, or singers like Taylor Swift or Harry Styles, or two that have a super huge fan base. And I think it's not as much about like, what you're a fan of. It's kind of like what goes into it. I think like women tend to be more fans of entertainment because they probably didn't have those experiences in sports, or those empowering experiences growing up. But really, if you look at it at the end of the day, like, how is wearing, a jersey of like Patrick Mahomes that different than going to like a Harry Styles concert? Like, they're kind of one and the same. They're just two different subjects. But I think what's really encouraging is like, look at like women's gymnastics. Like, even though it's not like it's women doing a sport, it's like actually more popular than men's gymnastics, and a lot of people, male or female, watch it. So I think that there is an audience and a market for women's wrestling. It's, typically seen as more of a masculine sport, but I think, when people watch it, like, it's an entertaining sport by nature. I think it just takes time and development, because a lot of people, especially a lot of women, are not going to grow up in a culture of combat sports. So we really have to bring
Right.
that to.
No, I think right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think it's interesting. So, like, the Taylor Swift analogy it was fascinating to me, because I never remotely thought of it in those terms. But like I said to you off the air, I think it's weird that a guy wears a jersey with some other guy's name on the back of it. Like, to me, it's like sort of like weird hero worship. Like I get to interview the best men and women in the world, and I wouldn't wear any of their jerseys. Like, I wouldn't wear their shoe with their name on it. And I mean, it's just like, to me, it's like, I would rather be friends with that person, or just admire them from a distance, as opposed to like literally label myself with their name on it. But I think you talked about the genesis of it too, which is really interesting, which is like, women, and it's getting better. Each generation is getting better, I think. But, women 20 years ago did not have the same opportunities in combat sport that men did. It wasn't that long ago that Dana White said, we'll never have women's fighting in the UFC. Now, their main events on pay-per-view. So, it did come, but it can't come quickly enough. And it's fascinating because I think if a lot of people are honest, when women's wrestling first happened, a lot of the old school people go, well, at least it'll help us with Title IX, right? Like wrestling used to be the sport that got axed because there was no equivalence. Like, all right, we don't care about women's wrestling, but we'll keep it because it'll help us with Title IX. No one would admit that out loud, okay? Like, it could be an absolutely asinine thing to admit. But I think if you could hook some people up to a lie detector, that's probably how they thought. I know for sure I've talked to some people that said that, but they weren't on the air, and I'm not going to repeat them. But I mean, like, I know that's how they looked at it. And now I think even those people watch the sport and like, man, it's so skilled, and it's a different kind of wrestling in that it's more flexibility and less on brute strength. And but the skill level, like you said, your coach Izzy, he could coach boys, girls, men, women, like great technique, great strategy is great technique and great strategy. It doesn't like excellence is excellence.
Yeah.
And so like, if you were sort of the czar of USA Wrestling or the czar of like sports in America, what is something that you would say would help grow either women's wrestling or just women's athletics?
Yeah, and I want to preface this by saying, like, I think wrestling on the senior level has come the farthest as far as, like, men and women are viewed very similarly on the senior level, especially by USA Wrestling. Like, they do a great job of, making sure things are equal between men and women as far as, like, opportunities and, being seen on, like, similar stages. I actually wrote this whole article about basically what it would take to grow women's sports as a whole. And it goes, I put in like a bunch of stats as far as like women's sports in general, and then as it relates to wrestling, and really like the potential for women's sports and women's wrestling is there. And I think you can, with enough time and enough kind of attention, you can bypass the part about like, oh, well, men wouldn't want to watch women's wrestling. Like you said, excellence is excellence. So like if Tamara Mensah-Stock is wrestling up on, at the US Open or at World Team Trials or whatever, you're going to watch it because she's awesome and she's a world champion, regardless. So I think that with enough time, that barrier will be bypassed. But what I really think it's going to take is just buy-in from a lot of different perspectives, like buying in from coaches as far as, I'm going to coach girls and I'm going to treat them, the girls and men, they're different. Women and men, but like treat them similarly to how I treat a male athlete as far as like the support I give them, and then also a lot of buy-in from the media. Like that was kind of a battle that it's definitely getting better, but it's nowhere near where it should be and can go in the future. It was a battle like we really fought a couple of years back on the How She Wrestles like movement, but because there was this kind of narrative of like, well, women's sports it's not like profitable. It's not a profitable thing. And there is like a certain amount of like men right now do get more views, but that's because their stories are put out more. So people are more familiar with the wrestlers that are out there. Like they know more about their lives and can feel more connected to them because there's what is put out on the media. Or women, when you don't get a lot of coverage, people don't know who's wrestling. They're not really connected to their personal stories, and it creates a lot of disinterest. So I think a lot of it is also buy-in from the media and being like, hey, we're gonna make these players or wrestlers like really well known, and we're going to put their stories out there that people can relate to, and we're going to really invest in this product. And it's shown over time that it can be very profitable. Like the Women's World Cup final is like one of the most viewed sporting events, regardless of gender. Or like women's gymnastics is one of the most watched sports in the Summer Olympics. So it's there. It definitely is there.
Yeah, you're right. Like and we say World Cup just so people, when you're talking about the soccer, right? Just so people know,
Yeah.
because just so people connect those things. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I'm going to say this. I don't know if anybody knows this, but like I used to do these podcasts for track wrestling, and this was when track and flow were separate. And I'm sure you remember this. There was a situation where like Pat Downey was being offered more money than like Sarah Hildebrandt. And the argument was, well, Sarah Hildebrandt was a world silver medalist at the time. I think just one time, not, she's multiple times medalist since then. At the time, she was a one-time silver medalist, and I don't think Downey had made a world team. And the argument was, well, but Downey's got more social media followers and more people will watch. And I'm a business guy by nature, so I don't think that argument is irrelevant. You know, I mean, like if you're trying to sell subscriptions and things like that, it's relevant. But I did this roundtable interview. It was one of my favorite ones ever, with several women. It was like Sarah, Jakara, people like that. And this is when track and flow were separate. And I was told, well, we're not going to put it up. And I'm like, why? And they said, well, because we didn't give Flo a chance to respond. I'm like, well, we can call Flo and have them, you know, they can respond on the air. And then, you know, at least, it's fine if they want to tell their side of the story. Like, we're just not going to put it up. And it was literally at that point where I was like, I'm looking for a new place to start doing these podcasts, because like it was a story, right? Like the story you've talked about is uncomfortable, but like the only way we grow is to talk about uncomfortable situations and see each other's point of views. Like, I have no idea where you stand politically on anything. And I'm sure if we talked about 10 controversial subjects, I'm sure we wouldn't agree on all 10 of them. But I feel like you seem like a super reasonable person. I'd like to think on a good day I'm a reasonable person. And even if we chose to disagree about a couple points, the conversation wouldn't end with, well, I'm never talking to you ever again. It's like, no, I see your point. I see my point. I still believe in my point, but your points are well thought out, and, you know, we can stay friends or friendly or whatever the case may be. So it's, I know that men spending monumental amount of dollars on sports. And I think that, you know, that's going to be a slow hill to climb. It's also fascinating to me that you said a great point. Like, at the highest level, it's really more equal, like how USA Wrestling treats them. I think the thing that's hurting women's wrestling, and it's coming, is the lack of college exposure, because there's these storylines, right? Like, I live in St. Louis, so everybody here loves Mizzou's wrestling. So like when Ben Askren came here, even though he wasn't from Missouri, he's from Wisconsin, he became a Mizzou guy. And everybody who's a Mizzou fan knew who Ben Askren was. And then when he makes an Olympic team, is like, that's our guy. You know, Jaden's from Columbia, that's our guy. But they get 4 or 5 years of seeing that person in that uniform, in that singlet. And, you know, that's where the ESPNs and these other people of the world are publicizing the university stuff. And so when women's wrestling is at the Iowas and the Oklahoma States and the Penn States and the Ohio States and all the other big programs in the country, I think like you may have come too early in time, Emma. Like, if you would come 15 years later, you know, you'd probably be running out from smoke in front of 16,000 people, you know, in a D1 Coliseum somewhere.
Like, I really do think it will get there. And like, that's a really big positive. But even just to point to like a parity from this weekend, like the Missouri Valley Invitational is one of the hardest women's college tournaments, like, period, because it combines like the best in the NAIA, the best of the NCAA, and the brackets are huge. I mean, they're like 66 person brackets, which even if you were to look at like a men's college tournament, you're not going to find a 66 person bracket.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So big tournament. And for like a huge tournament like that, like normally if it was a men's tournament, there'd be, you know, whether it's Flo or whoever's putting the tournament on, there'd be people out there doing commentating, you know, and there was commentating by Derek Lewandowski, who does like American Women's Wrestling, but there was no commentating from, I think Flo was the one who put on the tournament. So it's like, if that was a men's tournament, you would for sure have people at least commentating in the semis and the finals, if anything, right? So there's certain things like that where if it's like, if this is really the biggest, you know, women's like tournament, we have to treat it like that. And there are storylines like, you know, my friend Cam Guerin, two-time NCAA champ, just wrestled Lexi Basham in the finals, who was in Final X last year and is also an NAIA champ. That's a huge story. And there's so much more that can be done with it than I think is doing right now. And that's not to say that it won't get there. I just think it takes like continuous advocacy. And I've been told a couple of times on certain issues, it's like, well, you kind of just have to sit back and wait, right? Like, sit back and wait. And it's like, you can still be an advocate of pushing things forward, while realizing that like, it's going to take time, right? Like, would we love there to be a women's D1 tournament tomorrow? Of course, but it's not ready yet. And it wouldn't be a good product because there's still a lot of development that needs to be done before we get to that point. But it doesn't mean we can't go to, schools and be like, hey, if you add women's wrestling, we can eventually make this great product and you guys can be a part of it. And right, like you said, having those athletes like for Iowa, or it doesn't just expose them to Iowa wrestling fans, it exposes them to the greater fans of Iowa University. So women, I think, luckily now at Iowa, like they're going to be exposed to that. But as a whole, like the more we get into that kind of D1 university space, like women can, do that as well. Like women's volleyball is a huge thing for D1 sports, and it draws a lot of attention, especially like the NCAA finals every year. So I think you can definitely get there. But I think it just is going to take a lot of people being advocates over a long period of time.
Yeah. And the storylines, I will say this in defense of Flow. Like I was at the Life University Open doing play-by-play, and they're being asked to stream so many events. It's hard to get announcers everywhere. I certainly see your point, but Flow's probably doing more for wrestling than just about anybody else besides USA Wrestling. So definitely love for those guys and gals. But it's tough. Like it's just an interesting paradigm where, however it goes, like the college storylines are super helpful for like when Thomas Gelman got upset his senior year by Darian Cruz and then didn't, so he didn't win an NCAA title as a huge favorite. And then they're in like the world team trials the next year. Anybody who's sort of a semi-hardcore wrestling fan goes, this is a revenge match, right? Mm-hmm. Because it was on ESPN on Friday night. Like it was on in sports bars in wrestling cities around the country. You don't have to have a Flow subscription and plug a laptop into a TV. Like it's on ESPN or ESPN2, where like no one, unless you're super hardcore female wrestling fan, is going to know that at the Nationals, they're running it back from the Missouri Valley Open back in November. Like Dake and Taylor, when they were wrestling against each other, like, well, they wrestled in the NCAAs, they wrestled in the All-Star meet, they wrestled the finals of Scuffle. There's all these different storylines, and people are able to follow them. And so I think the college piece of it is so important for women's wrestling, because those storylines become something people going to just, they can follow. Like I was in a sports bar Saturday night watching 4 football games talking about how it's going to affect the playoffs. I never played football. I don't bet on football anymore, but it's still something to talk about. I would love for women's wrestling to be at that point. I think the other thing too is like, I don't have anybody outside of my wrestling family to talk to women's wrestling about. They don't know. Like I can talk to anybody at a sports bar about football, Yeah.
No, 100%. And I think so I know my friend Lauren Mason works for Flow. I think she's one of their marketing people, but she's been instrumental, I think, about posting more of the women's stuff. And like Flow definitely has gotten better over the years. I'm not like a Flow hater or someone that doesn't, like them. It's hard because they are really the only ones doing what they do at such a high level, right? So it's like there's not a lot of other people in the space like putting out content like that. And I think that the trick with women's wrestling where it's tough is like there's not a lot of publications other than Flow. Like Derek, has AWW, Reaper Wrestling puts out stuff sometimes, but and I've worked for both of those companies as like writers, and I did a lot of stuff for Reaper Wrestling. But it's hard because they're not at the point yet where they're monetizing anything. So they can't really pay people to do work for them. So then it's these individuals just taking on this, a large amount of work, mostly because they have, Derek has daughters in the sport and he's just a general fan of the sport, or Reaper Wrestling, they're just fans of the sport, right? So it does take buy-in from people like that to kind of get it started, but it takes just overall buy-in of like, maybe from someone like Flow or similar kind of things, which they have done a much better job of, in the last couple of years of like, hey, we're going to really put those storylines out there and create this product that people are interested in. And I definitely think it's getting there because there's more prominent rivals on the senior level. Like even this year, me and Mal, like there was a certain amount of building up, I think, in a couple Flow videos, or when I wrestled Forrest in Turkey, there was like kind of some videos to build up like, oh, hey, this is a rematch from the Kolob or the Eurigans. Yeah. Definitely getting there.
Yeah. I could probably talk to you for another hour about this stuff. And honestly, it makes me feel good that I'm doing the smallest of parts to try to make it better. Your stories was really interesting. And, like, I think I was probably like a lot of people, like I was a fan of yours because you're a good wrestler. And, from what you see, you're a very nice person, but you don't know. And then you start reading about these injuries and everything else. And I'm like, I'm not sure that this is a story that's being told to a big enough audience. And so I appreciate you coming on and just being really honest without being, I don't sense any sort of malice or mean spiritedness. Like there's no anger, there's no trying to get back at anybody. It's just, this is what happened to me. This is why I made my decision. And this is some positive suggestions so somebody else doesn't have to go through what I went through. And that's kind of what struck me the most about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And yeah, really like there's no ill will, even though I feel like I wasn't in a very fair circumstance, or, it wasn't maybe fair of like the people I was working with at the time. Like I definitely learned a lot from it, and I hope that other people can, and other coaches especially, can take from that experience. And that's why like I put stuff out there like that, not because I think it's going to feel great to write this very intense article, but because I'm like, I really do want to change the culture around, coaching in regards to how women are coached, and just in general how women are viewed. And so like, you're playing your part by having women on the podcast. I feel like that's how I play my part, is just being honest and vulnerable, because I think sometimes wrestlers can give kind of the same cut and dry answers, and I want people to know what really goes on behind the scenes. So that's what I definitely tried to do with the article. And thank you so much for giving me this platform to speak about my experience.
For sure. Like in the interviews, we talk about whether somebody like does the Derek Jeter or Tom Brady on you, where they talk for 20 minutes and said nothing. And You're the absolute opposite of that. You are a pleasure to talk to. I hope at some point at one of these events, I get to bump into you in person and shake your hand, and thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thanks so much, David.
For Emma, I'm David. Thank you guys for watching and listening. We'll speak to y'all soon.